My name is Elena Marsh, and I am 43 years old. 6 years ago, my mother stood in my father's kitchen and told me that if I had this baby, I shouldn't call her when the bank hung up on me. Last Tuesday, at 9:40 in the morning, she called me instead and asked me for $46,000. She didn't open with a question, she opened with a number. That's how I knew, before she said another word, that nothing about how she saw me had changed in 6 years. But here's what she didn't know. I'd been keeping a folder since the night she said it. Navy blue, the accordion kind with the elastic string closure, and it was sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk, 3 feet from where I was standing when the phone rang. If you've ever had someone treat your success like an inconvenience to their story about you, stay with me, because I think you'll recognize a lot of what's coming. And if it's all right with you, hit subscribe before we go back 6 years. Not because I need the number, but because I want you still here when we get to the kitchen table, because that's the part that matters. Let me take you back 6 years, to a town most people have never heard of unless they've broken down on the highway near it. Aldridge, population around 6,200 depending on who you ask at the DMV, one blinking light at the center of town, a Lutheran church on the corner across from Marsh Hardware and Supply, which my father built with his own hands starting in 1987 and which my brother Trevor now ran the counter of most days. My mother, Diane, had worked the register there for 31 years. Same stool, same green apron, and she measured a life well lived by whether the store was still standing at the end of it. My father, Walter, mostly just worked. He wasn't a talker. He was the kind of man who showed love by fixing your car without being asked and never mentioned it again. The store itself was the family's whole identity, in a way that took me years to fully understand from the outside. My grandfather had run a much smaller version of it 2 towns over until it failed in the early 60s, a fact my mother mentioned maybe twice in my entire childhood, always quickly, always followed by a change of subject. My father built his version from almost nothing, a single rented storefront and a used forklift, and grew it, slowly, into the only hardware store within 18 miles, the place where 3 generations of Aldridge families bought their nails, their paint, their propane tanks, and their small talk all at once. Losing it wasn't just a financial event in my family's mind. It was a verdict on whether the Marsh name had actually amounted to anything, which is a heavier thing to carry into a negotiation than any single dollar figure. I left Aldridge at 18 for a state school 2 hours away, and I never really moved back, not the way people mean when they say that. I became a lending analyst at a regional bank, the kind of job where you spend your 20s learning to read a small business's bank statements the way other people read faces. You can tell when a company is dying 8 months before the owner admits it to themselves. I was good at it. I was 31 when I got my own portfolio of accounts, and 34 when I got a promotion that came with a corner cubicle instead of an actual office, which in banking is basically the same as a parade. I was 37 when I found out I was pregnant. The father wasn't someone I was going to marry, and I want to be honest with you the way I've tried to be honest with everyone in this story. It wasn't an accident I regretted, it was a decision I made with open eyes, alone, in an apartment 40 minutes from the bank, at an age where I finally had savings, a title, and enough of myself figured out that I thought I could do this well. He and I had been seeing each other for about a year, on and off, and when I told him, he was kind about it in the specific, hedging way of a man who knows the honest answer is not with me, but doesn't want to be the villain of the sentence. We agreed, calmly, without any drama either of us needed to perform, that he'd be a presence in Lucy's life on his own terms and I'd be raising her, day to day, on mine. That arrangement has held for 6 years, quiet and unremarkable, which is exactly what both of us wanted from it. I called my mother on a Sunday afternoon to tell her before she heard it from anyone else, because Aldridge is the kind of town where news outruns the person it's about. She was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted them, the way I count everything. An old habit from 10 years of reading numbers for a living. Then she said, "Elena, you are 37 years old, unmarried, and you want to do this now, when your career is finally somewhere?" I told her the career was fine, that I'd thought this through. She said, "You have not thought this through. You have gotten yourself into something and now you're calling it a plan." And then, the line, the one I'd hear again in my own kitchen 6 years later, almost word for word, "Don't call me when the bank hangs up on you." She told my father before I could. She told my Aunt Carol, her older sister, in a tone that made it sound less like news and more like a warning label. By the following weekend, it had gone around the whole extended family, the way Aldridge news does. Through the church, through the hardware store counter, through Trevor's wife at the grocery store checkout. Nobody called to ask how I was doing. 2 people called to ask, carefully, delicately, whether I'd thought about my options, which is a small-town way of asking whether I planned to have the baby at all. I had. I just hadn't planned to explain myself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. My Aunt Carol was the one exception. She called on a Wednesday, 11 days after my mother did, and the first thing she said was, "What size crib do you have room for?" Not a question about my choices. A question about furniture. Carol was 61 that year, divorced, no kids of her own by circumstance rather than preference, and she drove the 2 hours to my apartment 3 weekends in a row that spring to help me get a nursery together out of a room that had been holding gym equipment I never used. She brought a second-hand rocking chair she'd reupholstered herself in a fabric with little foxes on it, and she brought casseroles and dishes she told me not to bother returning. That was the shape of my life for the next several years. My mother's silence on one side, weighing more than any argument could have, and Carol's small, unglamorous, completely reliable presence on the other. I want you to hold both of those in your head as we go, because everything that happens later only makes sense if you remember that it was never a story about a family being uniformly cruel. It was a story about which people showed up and which people waited to see how it would turn out before deciding. I should tell you a little more about where all of this came from because it didn't start with the pregnancy. It started decades earlier in small, ordinary ways that only look like a pattern once you've had enough years to line them up. Trevor is 2 years younger than me, and when we were kids, Trevor got the bigger bedroom because, as my mother put it at the time, boys need more space to be boys. I got straight A's for most of elementary school and never once got so much as a certificate hung on the refrigerator, because in my mother's eyes, that was simply what was expected of me. Trevor brought home a C+ in 10th grade, and my parents took him out for pizza because, as my father said, not unkindly, just honestly, the boy tried hard this time. I learned early that the currency in that house wasn't achievement. It was whichever child my mother currently felt needed defending. When I got a partial academic scholarship to college, nobody in my family came to the small ceremony the school held for scholarship recipients that spring. My mother said it was a 2-hour drive and she had the store's inventory to do. When Trevor, 3 years later, got his GED after dropping out at 17, my mother invited half the church to a celebration dinner at the house. I don't say any of this to make Trevor into a villain. He was a kid getting handed something he hadn't earned, the same as I was a kid getting handed a bar that kept moving higher no matter how many times I cleared it. We were both just doing what children do with whatever role gets assigned to them. My father, through all of it, was the quiet one. Not cruel, never cruel, just absent in the specific way of a man who believed loudly disagreeing with his wife would cost him more than staying silent ever would. He would slip me $20 before I drove back to college, folded into my palm during a hug, never mentioned again, the same way he'd later fold $50 into a card for Lucy's birth with no note attached. That was his whole language. I understood it, mostly. I just wished for a long time that love with him didn't always have to come with a silencer on it. If a family treated your milestone like a countdown to your failure instead of news worth celebrating, I want to hear that story in the comments, only if it's the kind of thing you're ready to say out loud. It helps me know I'm not just telling my own story into the wind. Lucy was born on a Thursday in October, 6 pounds 9 ounces, at 3004 in the afternoon. My mother did not come. My father sent a card with a $50 bill folded inside it and no note, which from Walter Marsh was a genuine gesture, not an insult. That man has never once written more than 4 words on a greeting card in his life. Carol was in the delivery room. She held Lucy for 11 minutes while I got stitched up and cried from exhaustion, and she told me, in the flattest, most matter-of-fact voice, that you did the hard part already. Everything from here is just what she said. Coming from Carol, that was a lovely one. I want to emphasize here because precision is the only tool I've ever really trusted. In the 6 years between that October afternoon and last Tuesday's phone call, my mother initiated contact with me exactly 4 times. Once, when Lucy was 2, to ask if I'd heard that a cousin was getting engaged. Once, when Lucy turned 3, and a mass text sent to 12 people wishing the family a happy new year. Once, to ask if I was coming to Trevor's son's baptism, a question that did not include an invitation for Lucy. And once, this is the 4th time, last Tuesday, at 9:40 in the morning, to ask for $46,000. Inoue called her. Not often, but I called, on her birthday, twice around Lucy's birthday, hoping this might be the year it landed differently. Once when Lucy said her first real sentence, which was "more cheese, please," delivered with the gravity of a Senate floor speech. My mother's longest response to any of these calls was 90 seconds. I know because I checked the call log afterward, the way I check everything. A woman apparently constitutionally unable to leave a number unexamined. I went back to work 14 weeks after Lucy was born, which is longer than the bank's official leave but shorter than I wanted, because that year the bank was quietly restructuring, and quiet restructuring is a phrase every lending analyst learns to fear. I kept my job. I kept doing it well. And somewhere in that first year, sitting across from small business owner after small business owner and watching the same handful of mistakes sink otherwise decent companies. Bad cash flow forecasting, mostly, people who could read a balance sheet but couldn't picture 6 months forward. I started sketching, on legal pads at first, a piece of software that could do what I did in my head for a living, except automatically, and cheaply enough that a store like my father's could actually afford it. I called it ClearTally. I built the first version of it on nights after Lucy went to sleep, in a 2-year stretch where I do not remember watching a single television show start to finish, where my social life was Carol's phone calls and one exhausted mom friend from daycare pickup, where I wrote code with a baby monitor propped against my laptop and taught myself things a finance degree doesn't teach you, because I could not afford to hire someone to teach me. I quit the bank when Lucy was 2.5, which everyone in my life who wasn't Carol thought was a catastrophic decision for a single mother to make. And I want to tell you honestly that there were 4 or 5 nights that first year where I sat at my kitchen table doing the math on my savings account and genuinely didn't know if they were wrong. Nobody in my family knew any of this was happening, not because I was hiding it dramatically, but because nobody asked, and I had stopped offering information to an audience that had made it clear they were only listening for confirmation of the ending they'd already written for me. There was one month, early on, I still think about more than almost any other. The March after Lucy turned 1, when a client I'd been counting on to renew for the year backed out with 8 days' notice, and my bank balance dropped to $411 with rent due in 6 days and a daycare invoice I hadn't figured out how to cover yet. I didn't call my mother. I want to be clear about that because it would have been the easiest thing in the world to do, and some small, tired 29 days without a full night's sleep, part of me genuinely considered it for about an hour one evening, sitting on my kitchen floor with Lucy asleep in the next room. I called Carol instead, not to ask for money, just to talk, and by the next morning there was an envelope with $300 in it, taped to my front door, no note, and a text that just said, "Found some extra in an old account, don't argue with me about it." I never did find out if that account was real or invented for my benefit. I've never asked. Some questions you let stay unanswered on purpose, because the answer matters less than the fact that she showed up. Year 1 of ClearTally, I had 6 customers, all small retailers I'd known from my banking days, all paying me what amounted to a part-time babysitter's wage, call it $1,100 a month, some months less. Lucy was still in a crib that year, and Carol drove up nearly every other Saturday with groceries she insisted were just extra from her own trip, though I later found the receipts in a coat pocket and realized she'd been shopping for 2 households on purpose the entire time. That was item 1 in the folder that didn't belong to the family at all. A good memory, tucked in next to the bad ones because I wanted the record to be honest, not just damning. Year 2, I had 31 customers and 1 employee, a college kid named Marcus who I paid more than I paid myself for the first 8 months because I'd read enough failed small businesses to know exactly which mistake I refused to make. That was also the year my mother sent back the second gift, a set of board books I'd mailed for Lucy's second birthday, no note, just the same padded envelope with my own handwriting on it and a fresh strip of tape. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that envelope for a long time before I put it in the box in the garage with the first one. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday I still remember because it was raining sideways, Carol showed up unannounced with a stuffed rabbit she'd made herself, hand-sewn, a tiny cape stitched onto its back because Lucy had been obsessed that month with a cartoon superhero. I still have that rabbit. Lucy still sleeps with it. Year 3, I had 104 customers, 3 employees, and an offer from a regional investor to buy a minority stake for $210,000, which I took, because it let me finally stop doing Lucy's daycare pickup at a dead sprint from a laptop I'd shut mid-sentence. That was also the year of the baptism invitation for Trevor's twins, an invitation that named every cousin's child by name on the little card except mine, as though Lucy simply didn't exist as a person worth listing. I went anyway, alone, held Lucy's hand through the whole thing at home over video call so she could at least see her cousins get blessed, and drove back that same night instead of staying for the dinner after, because nobody had set a plate for either of us. Somewhere in there, my mother texted the family group chat that she hoped everyone was staying warm. I didn't reply. I was 3 days from a product launch and had exactly 1 hour of sleep behind me. If you've ever noticed that the people who show up for you rarely announce it, and the people who don't tend to be the loudest ones in the room whenever there's an audience watching, I think you already know exactly the kind of imbalance I'm describing. Let me know down below if any of this is sounding familiar, only if it actually is. I'm not trying to invent a wound that isn't there for you. I want to pause here and be direct with you about something because I think it's the part of this kind of story people skip past too quickly. I was not building this company as a message to my mother. I told myself that for a long time that I wasn't proving anything, I was just building a life. But if I'm being fully honest in this telling, there was a version of me, somewhere around year 2, lying awake doing payroll math at 1 a.m., who absolutely wanted her to be wrong. I don't think that's a shameful thing to admit. I think wanting to be underestimated correctly is one of the more human motivations there is. I just want you to know I saw it in myself even while it was happening. Year 4 brought the first real inflection point for ClearTally, a partnership with a small regional retail association that put my software in front of nearly 300 stores at once, and a jump in revenue that let me move Lucy and me out of the one-bedroom apartment and into an actual house with a yard, the first yard she'd ever had. I called my mother that week, genuinely excited, and told her about the house before I told almost anyone else. Some stubborn part of me still hoping the news might land as news instead of as a threat. She asked if the yard was fenced because of liability, and then asked whether I was still seeing anyone, in a tone that made clear she considered the house a consolation prize for a life she still thought had gone wrong somewhere. The call lasted 4 minutes. I checked afterward, the way I check everything. Year 5 was quieter on the surface and louder underneath it. Lucy started asking, out of nowhere one evening while I was making dinner, why she didn't have a grandma who came to see her the way her friend Maya's grandma did. I told her some families just look different from other families, which felt true and also felt like the kind of answer you give a child when you don't yet have a better one. That same year, Carol drove out for Lucy's first day of kindergarten specifically to be the adult standing at the bus stop taking pictures, because she said, plainly, somebody from this family needs to be in that photo, and it's clearly going to be me. I have that photo printed and framed in my hallway. My mother is not in a single photograph of Lucy's childhood, not one, in 5 years out of the several hundred I've taken. And it was also year 5 when a former colleague from the bank, a guy named Doug who still worked in small business lending and had grown up 2 towns over from Aldridge, mentioned to me over coffee, half as gossip and half as professional curiosity, that Marsh Hardware had drawn down its line of credit twice that year and missed a payment once. He didn't know it was my family's store. I'd made sure years earlier, on purpose, that my file at the bank never crossed paths with theirs. I just said, "That's rough," and changed the subject, and went home that night and didn't sleep well, for reasons I couldn't fully explain to myself at the time. If any part of this is landing for you the way I hope it is, go ahead and subscribe now, before we get to the part where the family finds out what I'd actually been building. Because I think what happens next says more about them than anything I could tell you directly. The folder started that same October my mother said what she said. I didn't plan it as evidence. I started it the way you start a lot of things when you're hurt and don't know what else to do with your hands. I wrote down the date and what she'd said, word for word, on a piece of notebook paper and put it in a drawer, because writing it down felt like the only way to make sure I wasn't imagining how bad it had actually been. After that, it became a habit. Every ignored call got a line, every returned baby gift, and there were 3, a onesie and 2 board books, sent back to me unopened with no note, which is its own kind of message, got a line. Every missed milestone. I was not building a case. I was keeping records. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always look like one from the outside. By year 4, the folder had 19 entries. By year 526, I wasn't counting toward anything. I genuinely believed, for most of those years, that this folder would simply live in a drawer forever, a private ledger nobody but me would ever read, evidence for a trial that was never going to happen because I had no intention of prosecuting anyone. If you've ever kept your own quiet record of the moments a person let you down, not to use against them, just to stay honest with yourself about what actually happened versus what you wished had happened, tell me in the comments. I think more of us do this than we admit out loud. Lucy, meanwhile, was thriving in kindergarten in the way small kids do when nobody's told them yet that life is supposed to be complicated. New best friend every Tuesday, a stubborn refusal to eat anything shaped like a vegetable, a real, specific fondness for her teacher that made me equal parts proud and mildly jealous. My father sent a card for her first day of school that fall too. $60 this time, no note, same as always, which I'd started to understand less as thoughtlessness and more as the only sentence Walter Marsh knew how to write in this particular language. There was a snowstorm that same winter, the kind that shuts down an entire county for 2 days, and my power went out at 8 in the evening with Lucy already running a low fever and a space heater that needed an outlet I no longer had. I called Carol before I called anyone else, out of instinct more than plan, and she was in her car within 11 minutes, chains on her tires, driving 40 minutes on roads the county hadn't plowed yet, because, as she told me flatly once she'd arrived, a 5-year-old with a fever is not a maybe, Elena, that's a yes every time, no matter the weather. She stayed 3 nights on my couch until the power came back, made Lucy toast cut into triangles every morning because Lucy had declared with total conviction that triangles tasted better than squares, and never once mentioned it to my mother because, she said, some things aren't information, they're just what you do. Lucy's kindergarten class put on a spring program that same year. A shuffling, off-key performance of songs about the seasons that ran maybe 15 minutes total, and Lucy had exactly one line, delivered at top volume to the wrong side of the auditorium. I sat in a folding chair with Carol beside me, recording on my phone with my hand pressed flat against my chest, and I remember thinking, with something between grief and relief, that this was probably the version of a full house my daughter was always going to get from this family, and that it was, somehow, already more than enough. That same fall, Claire Talley got written up in a regional business journal, a piece about founders in our state-building software outside the usual coastal tech corridors. It was a small mention, 400 words, a photo of me and Marcus in our tiny rented office space that we'd only just moved into. I didn't send it to anyone in my family. I didn't think to. It felt like a footnote in my own life, not a headline in theirs. But here is how these things travel in a town like Aldridge, where everybody's cousin knows everybody's coworker. A woman named Patty, who went to my mother's church and whose daughter worked at the same regional bank Doug did, saw the article shared on that daughter's social media because the daughter had gone to college with Marcus. Patty mentioned it to my mother at a Sunday potluck, the way you'd mention weather. Isn't that your Elena? The software company? My mother, by every account I later heard secondhand, said only, I wouldn't know anything about that, and changed the subject fast enough that two separate people remembered it as odd. That was the end of Act 1 of my mother finding out. She knew something now. She didn't reach out. Nobody in my family reached out. They were, I'd learn later, doing something else entirely. They were finding out how much, exactly, and deciding what to do with the number. Let me tell you what was actually happening on their end of things during that same stretch, because I only learned the full shape of it afterward, the way you learn about weather that already passed by looking at the flood damage. Marsh Hardware and Supply had been bleeding for 2 years by then. A big box hardware chain had opened 40 minutes away, cutting Trevor's foot traffic by something like a third. My father, who was 68 that year and still working full days because retirement had never been financially real for him, had quietly remortgaged the house, the same house I grew up in, against the business twice, trying to keep it afloat, each time telling my mother it was temporary. The bank Trevor and my father used, not my old bank, had started sending letters with language in them that anyone who's worked in lending recognizes instantly as a countdown. My brother Trevor is not a subtle man. He is kind in his own blunt way and cruel in the same breath, sometimes in the same sentence, and he has never once in his life kept an opinion to himself past the point of it being wise to. It was Trevor who, in a family group chat that also happened to include his wife's sister, who happened to still have me in a much older, mostly dormant group thread from a cousin's wedding 3 years prior, a thread none of them remembered I was technically still in, silenced but not left, wrote the message that became my Act 4. I found it on a Tuesday night in early spring, scrolling absent-mindedly through an old notification, the kind of accidental discovery that happens once every few years and changes everything. The message, time-stamped 8:52 p.m., read, Ma won't ask her herself, too proud, so somebody's gotta make a list. Specific numbers, not vague. She's good with numbers, she'll respect that more than a sob story. She owes this family that much at least. We're the ones who'll actually still talk to her when this settles down. I read it 4 times. Then I took a screenshot because that's what I do, that's what 9 years of banking trained into me. You document first, you feel things second. I sat with my phone in my lap for a long time after that, long enough that the screen dimmed twice and I had to tap it awake again, just staring at Trevor's sentence about how I'd respect numbers more than a sob story. Turning it over the way you turn over a rock in a yard, checking what's underneath it before you decide whether to put it back. I did not call Trevor. I did not call my mother. I called my accountant the next morning, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya, who'd helped me set up Claire Talley's finances from the beginning, and I asked her one question. Was Lucy's college fund, which I'd started the year the investor money came in, protected in a way that couldn't be touched or guilt-tripped out of me in a moment of weakness? She walked me through the trust structure we'd already built, an irrevocable arrangement, Lucy as sole beneficiary, an independent trustee who wasn't me, specifically so that no version of me, however tired or however guilty, could quietly redirect it in a moment of pressure. She confirmed it was airtight, then said something I've thought about 100 times since. You're not calling me because you're scared of losing money, Elena. You're calling me because you're scared of what you'll say yes to if you're not prepared. She wasn't wrong. I also asked her, almost as an afterthought, What she thought I should actually do if the ask came, when it came, not if. She didn't tell me to refuse outright, and she didn't tell me to write a check either. She said the thing that ended up shaping the whole rest of this story without either of us fully realizing it in the moment. Whatever you decide, decide it as something you're choosing to do, not something you're being cornered into. The difference matters more than the number will. I wrote that sentence down too, on the same kind of notebook paper the folder was full of, and it sat in my desk for 4 days before I needed it. I told Carol. Just Carol, over coffee at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd taught me to make her one good pot roast recipe 2 winters earlier. She read the screenshot twice, set the phone down carefully like it might go off, and said, "They're not going to ask you as your family. They're going to ask you as a resource." I told her I knew. She asked what I was going to do. I said I honestly didn't know yet, but that whatever it wasn't going to be decided in a moment, on the phone, at 9 in the morning, which, I want you to notice, is exactly how it happened anyway 4 days later, because plans made in advance rarely survive contact with your mother's actual voice. My mother called at 9:40 on a Tuesday morning. I was between meetings, standing in my kitchen, a mug of coffee going cold on the counter behind me. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't, because some part of me, even after everything, still answers when she calls, the way you still flinch at a sound your body learned to fear a long time ago, even once you know it can't actually hurt you anymore. "Elena," she said, "no hello, we need $46,000 by the 15th or the bank takes the store. And likely the house right behind it, because your father was foolish enough to put the house up too." I asked how long they'd known this was coming. She said, "That's not the point right now." I asked why she was calling me and not a bank, a lawyer, anyone whose job this actually was. She said, "Because you're the one in this family who has it, Elena. We all know that now, so let's not pretend otherwise." 23 words. I counted them without meaning to. It's a habit I've never managed to fully turn off. I told her I needed to think, and that I wasn't going to make this decision on a phone call. She said, "There's nothing to think about, this is your father's whole life's work." And I said I understood that, and I hung up before either of us could turn it into the kind of conversation that leaves a mark you can't take back. Then I called her back 40 minutes later and asked her and my father and Trevor if he wanted to come to my house on Sunday. My house, my kitchen, my table. I chose the ground, on purpose, the way you'd choose the room for any meeting where you already know the stakes. If you've ever had to decide in real time whether love and money were the same conversation or two completely different ones that somebody was trying to force into a single sentence, I need you to hear the rest of this, because I think it's the part that actually matters. And if this story is landing for you so far, subscribing costs you nothing and helps someone else find it who might need to hear it exactly the way you did. I spent the morning before they arrived doing something almost embarrassingly ordinary. I made Lucy pancakes, dropped her at her friend Maya's house at 10, and came home to a kitchen that suddenly felt too quiet and too large. I set out 4 mugs I didn't end up needing and put them back in the cupboard, then took them back out again, because I couldn't decide whether coffee was a hospitality or a concession, and in the end I left them out simply because Carol told me, arriving an hour early with her own thermos anyway, that a kitchen with no coffee in it looks like a courtroom, and you don't want this to look like a courtroom, even though in every way that matters, it is one. She was right, as she almost always is about rooms and what they say without anyone speaking. I put the navy folder on the counter by the coffee maker at 10:40, then moved it to the drawer, then took it back out again at 10:55, because some part of me was still, even after everything, negotiating with itself about whether I'd actually go through with reading it out loud, or whether I'd fold at the first hint of my mother's disappointment the way I had for 37 years before Lucy was born. I want to be honest and tell you I didn't know, right up until the moment I actually opened it at that table, which of those two versions of me was going to show up. They arrived Sunday at 11 in the morning. My mother first, in the same navy coat she'd worn to my college graduation 19 years earlier. My father behind her, quieter than I'd ever seen him, looking at my kitchen like it belonged to a stranger, which, in fairness, it did. Trevor came too, uninvited by name but not turned away, standing near the door with his arms crossed the way he'd stood in every family disagreement since we were teenagers. Carol was already there. I'd asked her the night before if she'd come sit with me, and she'd said, "I was going to invite myself if you hadn't asked," and arrived an hour early to help me make coffee nobody was going to drink calmly. Lucy was at a friend's house for the afternoon. I'd made sure of that. Whatever this was going to be, it wasn't going to happen in front of a 5-year-old. My mother sat down at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought with Clear Tally's first real profit, and she started talking before her coat was even off. "We don't have time for pleasantries, Elena. The bank's letter says the 15th. That's 11 days. I asked her to actually sit, coat off, coffee if she wanted it. She didn't want it. She wanted the number. I went to the drawer. I want to tell you my hands weren't shaking, because that's the version of this story where I come across as some kind of ice queen, unbothered, superhuman, and that's not true. My hands were shaking. I brought the navy folder to the table anyway and sat down across from her, with my father to her left, silent, and Trevor standing behind them both, and Carol standing near the counter saying nothing, her presence alone doing more work in that room than any sentence could have. Before we talk about a number, I said, I want to read you some other numbers first. My mother said this wasn't the time. I told her it was exactly the time, because I'd waited 6 years for a version of this conversation to happen and I wasn't going to let it happen on her terms, in her order, one more time. I opened the folder. I read it the way I used to read loan files at the bank. Factual, organized, item by item, no drama in my voice. Because the drama wasn't the point, the record was. October 14th, 6 years ago. You told me not to call you when the bank hung up on me. I have not called a bank in 6 years, Mom, not once. I want you to sit with that before we go further. My mother started to speak. I kept going because Article 7 of every version of this story I'd ever imagined telling myself is that the family talks more, the family gets loud, and the protagonist stays flat, and I understood in that moment, finally, why that's the actual power move and not just a nice idea. In 6 years, you initiated contact with me 4 times. The engagement, the New Year's text, the baptism invitation that didn't include Lucy, and 11 days ago asking for money. 3 baby gifts were sent back to me unopened. I have them still, in a box in the garage if you want to see them today. You have never met your granddaughter. She turned 6 in October. She asks me sometimes why she doesn't have a grandma who visits, and I have run out of gentle ways to answer that question. My father made a sound, low, almost a cough, and looked down at the table. My mother's jaw was tight enough that I could see it from across the table. I kept reading, the way I used to read a delinquency file line by line for a loan committee, because that was the only voice I trusted myself to use in that room. Item 4. Lucy's first steps, at 11 months, on a Tuesday afternoon, in the kitchen of the one-bedroom apartment none of you ever visited. Item 9. Lucy's first day of preschool, which nobody in this family acknowledged in any form. Item 14. The baptism invitation for the twins that named every cousin's child except mine. Item 21. 61 weeks ago, this exact phrase, from you, Mom, at a wedding I wasn't at to hear directly but was told about within 4 days, she'll come around once she's tired of doing it alone. Item 26, the most recent one, dated 11 days ago, a phone call asking for $46,000, opening with the number before a single word of greeting. I closed the folder. 26 items, 6 years. I want that number sitting in this kitchen with us before we talk about yours. The room was quiet for what felt like a genuinely long time. I counted it without meaning to, the way I count everything. 9 seconds, maybe 10, nobody speaking, my father's eyes fixed on a knot in the wood grain at my kitchen table like it might offer him something useful to say. I built a company you didn't know existed until a woman at your church mentioned it to you at a potluck, and you told her you didn't know anything about it. I have 104. Now it's closer to 200. Small businesses using software I wrote at my kitchen table with a baby monitor next to my laptop because I couldn't afford childcare and a developer at the same time. I have never once in 6 years asked this family for $1. Not when my savings account had 4 figures in it and I genuinely didn't know if I'd made a mistake. Not once. I paused. So when you tell me I owe this family, I need you to explain to me what, exactly, you think I've been given, that I now owe interest on. My mother's composure held for maybe 11 more seconds, and then it didn't. Her voice, when it finally broke, wasn't loud. It was smaller than I'd ever heard it. You don't understand what it's like to watch your own child throw away her future, she said. Because I did that, Elena. Not with a baby. With your father, when I was 22, everyone told me I was ruining myself, marrying a man with no money and no plan, and my own mother didn't speak to me for 2 years, and I swore I would never let a daughter of mine walk into that kind of risk, blind, the way I did. Her hands were shaking now, too. I wasn't trying to punish you. I was trying to stop you from becoming me. And it took me 6 years to understand that you were never in danger of that at all. You were just better at this than I ever was, and I don't know what to do with how that makes me feel. It was the one real crack. Genuine, unscripted, the kind you can't fake even if you wanted to. And then, almost as fast as it had opened, it closed again. But that doesn't change the fact that this family raised you, and now we need help, and pride isn't going to fix a mortgage, Elena. Just like that, back to the number. Back to the ask. I want you to notice that too, because I think it's the most honest thing about this whole story. People can hand you a real, true human moment and still, in the very next breath, try to collect on it like an invoice. I told her no. Not to the $46,000, not in the form she'd asked for it. I told her I wasn't going to hand a check to a family that had spent 6 years assuming I'd fail and was only speaking to me now that I hadn't. But I looked at my father, who still hadn't said a word, and I told him I would call the bank myself, as someone who used to do exactly this job for a living, and I would pay the overdue balance on the business line of credit directly to the lender, not to any of them, enough to buy 60 days and stop the immediate foreclosure clock, on the condition that Trevor and my father sat down with an actual restructuring plan, the kind I could help build if they wanted it, because that's a service, not a rescue. Trevor said from the doorway, "That's not the same as just giving us the money." I told him it wasn't supposed to be, and I looked at him directly for maybe the first time since he'd walked in. "You wrote that message, Trevor? She's good with numbers. She'll respect that more than a sob story." "You were right about one thing in it. I do respect numbers. I don't respect being treated like a line item on somebody else's spreadsheet, especially by my own brother. He had the decency to look at the floor after that, and he didn't say anything else for the rest of the visit. I don't think he expected me to have seen the message at all, let alone to be able to quote it back to him word for word. And I'll admit there was a small, private part of me that took some satisfaction in watching him realize it." My father finally spoke, for the first time since he'd sat down, his voice rough in a way I hadn't heard since I was a teenager. "I never sent that message. I want you to know that." I told him I knew, that I'd never once thought he had it in him to write something like that, and that was exactly the problem. He'd never had it in him to say much of anything, in either direction, for as long as I could remember. He nodded slowly, like a man agreeing with a verdict he'd already reached about himself a long time ago and just hadn't said out loud yet. My mother said nothing else for a long moment. Carol, finally, quietly said, "Diane, that's more than you came here expecting, take it," which is the only sentence she said the entire visit, and it landed harder in that room than anything I'd said. My mother looked at Carol for a moment, something passing between two sisters that I'll never fully know the history of, and then she nodded, once, and stood up to put her coat back on, and that was the end of it. No thank you. No apology. Just a nod and the sound of the front door closing behind three people who had come in expecting a rescue and left with something smaller and, I think, more honest. Carol stayed another hour after they left, and we didn't talk much, mostly just sat at the table where the folder had been, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm without either of us noticing. At one point she reached over and put her hand flat on top of mine, the way you'd steady something that might still be shaking even after the danger's technically passed, and said, "You did that exactly the way I'd have wanted a daughter of mine to do it if I'd had one." I told her she basically had, all things considered, and she laughed for the first time all day, a real laugh, the kind that breaks tension instead of just filling silence. I called the bank myself the next morning, using the same clipped, professional voice I'd used for 9 years reading other people's numbers back to them, and arranged the direct payment to cover the overdue balance on the line of credit. 61 days worth of runway, wired straight to the lender's account with my father's business listed as the reference, never touching a hand or an account belonging to my mother or Trevor at any point in the process. I wanted the paper trail to say exactly what I'd meant it to say. This was a business transaction between a former lending analyst and a struggling small business, not a daughter finally caving to her mother's version of the story. The restructuring plan actually happened, which surprised me more than I let on at the time. I connected Trevor with a small business consultant I trusted, someone I'd worked adjacent to during my banking years, and over about 6 weeks they mapped out a real plan. A renegotiated payment schedule with the bank, a modest inventory cut on the slowest moving stock, and a decision, finally, to add an online ordering option that the big box competitor 40 minutes away didn't bother offering to a town the size of Aldridge. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. But 8 months later, Trevor sent me a 2-line email, no small talk, just a screenshot of the store's first quarter in the black in almost 3 years. And the words, "Consultant helped, figured you'd want to know the numbers actually worked." I didn't reply with anything sentimental. I just wrote back, "Good. Keep the reorder thresholds where she set them. Don't get greedy in month 4, because that's the only language Trevor and I have ever really shared, and it turns out it was enough." 3 months later, my father called me on a Thursday evening, which he had never once done in my entire life without my mother initiating it first. He said, "I should have called you the week Lucy was born. I should have driven over that first winter when you didn't sleep for 2 weeks straight. Your mother told me not to make a fuss, and I let her decide that for both of us, and I've thought about that more than I've told anyone." I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him we could start slow. A phone call every couple of weeks, no visits yet, definitely no money either direction, just talking, actually talking, and seeing what that turned into over time. He agreed, and so far, 11 months later, it has turned into something small but real. He's met Lucy twice now, both times at a park, both times bringing a bag of butterscotch candies she now specifically asks for by name. My mother sent one text message after that Sunday. It said, "Hope you're both well. No name signed, no follow-up since." I don't know if that door opens again someday. I've stopped waiting to find out, which is different from having given up hope. It's just that I stopped organizing my life around a question only she can answer. Most Sundays now, dinner is at 6,030. Lucy sets the table wrong on purpose because she thinks it's funny. Forks on the wrong side, napkin under the plate instead of beside it, waiting every single week to see if I'll notice before she tells me. Carol comes over more weekends than not, still making the same pot roast, still refusing to let me buy the ingredients for it even though I've offered probably 40 times by now. Lucy still sleeps with Colonel Carrot's cape and all, more than 6 years old now, and held together mostly by Carol's careful restitching and my strict refusal to ever let that rabbit go through the wash on the wrong cycle again. Clear Tally has close to 300 customers now, 11 employees, and an office with actual windows, which felt like an unreasonable luxury the first month we moved in, and now just feels like Tuesday. Marcus still works with me. He runs half the engineering team now, and he still teases me, gently, about the year I paid him more than I paid myself, which he insists on calling the year you basically adopted me professionally, which is closer to true than either of us likes to admit out loud. My father calls most Sundays around 4, before dinner, and we mostly talk about nothing. Weather, the store, whether Lucy's lost any more teeth, and have come to understand that talking about nothing, consistently, on a schedule, is its own kind of repair, slower than an apology but somehow more durable than one. My mother sent one text message after that Sunday. It said, "Hope you're both well. No name signed, no follow-up since, and I've stopped checking whether a second one is coming." I don't say that with bitterness anymore, which surprised me when I noticed it. It's just a fact I've made peace with. The same way I made peace, eventually, with the size of my childhood bedroom. That's my story. 6 years, 26 items in a Navy folder, one restructuring plan that actually worked, and one phone call I finally didn't answer the way she expected me to. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from it, it's this. The people who bet against you rarely apologize when they turn out to be wrong. Mostly they just quietly change the subject, the way my mother did at that potluck, and the only real victory is reaching a point where you don't need them to say it out loud anymore. If someone in your life is waiting to see how you turn out before deciding how to treat you, I hope you find the version of this table that's yours, whatever room, whatever chair, whatever Navy folder that ends up being for you. I think about that folder sometimes, sitting back in the bottom drawer of my desk now, closer to full than empty, and I don't know if I'll ever add another item to it, or whether that Sunday was the last entry it needed. Either way, I'm not planning to throw it out, not out of spite, and not because I'm waiting for a reason to use it again. I think I'm keeping it the way you keep a fire extinguisher. You hope never to need, twice. Proof that you were paying attention, once when it actually mattered, and proof, on the days you doubt yourself, that the version of events you remember and the version that actually happened were, in fact, the same thing all along. If this one hit home, share it with somebody who needs to hear it today, and if you want, tell me down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I like knowing how far these stories travel, and I read every single one. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.